whenever you make a key decision, you need to think about what your adversary or competitor is likely to do in response. So Otto von Bismarck, the German leader, remarked that it's very dangerous to play chess one move at a time, to think only about the move you're going to make and not the move that the adversary will make in response and what that will mean to the game. And so the problem, one of the problems is misperception, that what the United States and the Republic of Korea may see as completely defensive, the North Koreans may see as an offensive threat that they need to respond to, and that response may endanger our security. And so to maximize our security, each time we're making a weapons purchase, laying out a military plan, taking a military action in a crisis or conflict, we need to think about how will that look to the other side and how will they respond and how will that affect our security. So think about in a crisis or as it might evolve into a conflict, imagine that the North Koreans commit another awful provocation, shelling an island again or something like that. South Korea might well believe that it was necessary and reasonable to strike back to reestablish deterrence. You could imagine that North Korea might see what the US and ROK forces had done as an escalation and might use a few conventionally armed missiles, perhaps on US air bases, to interfere with what we were doing and as a warning. But once the North Koreans started using missiles, the United States and the Republic of Korea might well decide we need to go after the North Korean missiles with the kill chain approach. That then puts the North Koreans in what strategists call a use them or lose them position, where if they don't use their nuclear weapons, they might not have them anymore. And the campaign to hunt for and destroy the North Korean missiles might look to North Korea very much like the campaign that would be the prelude to invading North Korea. And so there's a real danger that that might provoke North Korean nuclear use. Nonetheless, I think that core deterrence is likely to be very strong. US and ROK forces combined can certainly defeat a North Korean invasion of the South if it's conventional only. And North Korea knows that there would be gigantic risks to the survival of its regime if it were to use nuclear weapons. So I worry more about the inadvertent steps to war when a crisis or small conflict is getting out of control, the things that happen that neither side initially intended before the conflict began. And so we have to think about the risk of what we may be provoking with each military action that we take. And the lessons of the crises of the Cold War, which we've been exploring in a bit more detail in a project we call Data for Deterrence in our Harvard group, is that crises are really very difficult to manage. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. John F. Kennedy, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, drew a number of lessons, but two of the important ones, I think, were, one, you always have to give your adversary some face-saving way to get out of the crisis without escalating the war. Two, in a crisis, modern militaries are large, unwieldy organizations. All sorts of things happen that neither leader actually intended. As he pithily put it, there's always one son of a bitch who doesn't get the word. So the need to deter without provoking the adversary to do more does create difficult dilemmas. The United States and the ROK, of course, would want to maintain conventional superiority over North Korea. And yet, if you look at these crises of the Cold War, when one side was really conventionally inferior, they were more likely to consider the use of nuclear weapons because they had few non-nuclear options. For example, West Berlin was completely surrounded by Soviet or East German forces. There was no way to defend it with conventional forces alone, and so the United States planned to use nuclear weapons early in a conflict if the Soviet Union ever tried to seize West Berlin. Fortunately, that plan deterred the Soviet Union from ever trying to seize West Berlin. So similarly, the ROK and the United States would like to maintain the ability to threaten North Korean missiles, North Korean leadership, but that threat then provokes the North Koreans to think, I need more, better, different missiles to keep my force survivable. And those dilemmas are not unique to this peninsula. They exist between the United States and China. They exist between the United States and Russia. There are certainly things the United States and NATO would like to do that would help Ukraine in its war that they don't do because they fear that it would provoke Russian actions that would be contrary to Ukraine's interests and to NATO's interests. And similarly, there are many things Russia would love to be able to do to prosecute its war in Ukraine that it doesn't do. It doesn't attack, for example, weapon supplies to Ukraine while they're still in NATO countries because it fears the result of provoking NATO. Ultimately, deterrence requires reassurance of the adversary. As Thomas Schelling put it, stop or I'll shoot implies if you stop, I won't shoot. And you have to convince the adversary that you won't shoot if they stop. And so reassurance becomes a fundamental part of successful deterrence. So what kinds of things could we do to try to mitigate some of these dilemmas? I think if we can find a way, and so far North Korea is just rejecting any outreach, but if we can find a way, reducing the temperature and the hostility and the intensity of the hostility on the peninsula is, I think, the most important step we could take. Systematically including the risk of provocation in our planning. We ought to have a group whose job is to constantly assess and be the sort of voice of provocation risk in a certain sense. There are confidence-building measures that could be taken, some of them unilaterally, even if North Korea isn't responding, some of them jointly if and when we manage to get back to talks with North Korea. And then ultimately, if we do manage to get back to talks with North Korea, they're not realistically giving up their nuclear weapons anytime soon. We should keep denuclearization as the long-term goal, but in the near term, we should focus on particular restraints that we think would reduce the risk. And we need to do more thinking about exactly what we would ask for in those first steps and what we would offer in return.